because it is 1 minute after 7. This is, I think, going to be a solo flight tonight, so I plan to drone on and on at you for 2 hours without stopping.
Solo meaning you want us to leave?
We watched
You see the, and so we'll go with that. We do acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory on the homeland of the Anishinaabe and Cree peoples, and that Manitoba also covers the homeland of the Dene. And of course, we are in the heart of the homeland of the Red River Métis. So we need to keep remembering that as we go along. I thought, because you probably needed a story to start, it was something I was working on yesterday, and you have to realize I am an academic, so I work on very obscure pieces of information. And so you would all be aware that in the Book of Common Prayer, that the opening exhortation in the service for morning prayer goes, "Dearly beloved brethren." You know that.
And sistren.
Dearly beloved brethren. And Inuktitut, that's Patamutika Nagligiyaka, which literally means my siblings, the ones I love. Patamutika is my siblings, Nagligiyaka is the ones I love. In the 1904 edition of the Inuktitut prayer book, there was a typographical error, not a surprise since the type was set in England and the English typographers didn't speak Inuktitut. And it says actually, Patamutika Niligiyaka, not Nagligiyaka, Niligiyaka, which unfortunately means my brothers and sisters, I fart at you. So, if you wonder why Indigenous grasps on Christianity may be different from yours, you may want to spend some time reflecting. And I could, by the way, do an entire 2-hour lecture on the significance of farting in Inuit culture, but I won't. I don't know, do you demonstrate the Hebrew Bible? I was going to say, there are some bits in the Hebrew Bible you may not want to demonstrate. So, anyways, that's just to get you guys thinking about what it is we actually are doing in all of this and reflecting on it. We're now talking about a fairly modern period, and one of the things that I'll try and mix in as we go along is a sense that this is the point at which the Anglican Church and actually most of the other churches start becoming much more active and much more involved. Some of you will remember some of the things we're going to talk about, and we have to think as we go along about the nature of that activism and what it's saying and how it's engaging and those kind of issues. But we need to begin. We talked last class about the white paper of 1969. And one of the things that was actually in the white paper that we didn't talk about was the white paper recommended a commission on native claims. And that, believe it or not, was the only part of the white paper that was actually followed up. Okay? That they did in fact establish a commission on native claims. Both hands there, yeah. It becomes, there's a long history of politics around that commission, and I'm not going to follow that through. But it becomes a fairly significant issue over the next few years. And most particularly in the very, very important and the very, very famous Calder decision of 1973. Calder was a Nishka man, actually it's Nishka from the west coast of British Columbia, Nishka about 2/3 of the way up BC. The Nishka had always pointed out that their lands had never been ceded and that there had never been any treaty or agreement over their lands. And the Nishka have been the people who have really fought the court cases. And Frank Calder filed a claim that the Nishka lands had never been ceded. It was turned down at the BC court level, the BC appeals court level. And so they took it on to the Supreme Court. And the decision is important because the Supreme Court actually recognizes, it's a 7-judge decision, the Supreme Court actually recognizes the existence of Aboriginal title. So the first time in the history of Canada, the courts actually recognize that Aboriginal title exists. Now, the unfortunate thing about the decision is that 3 judges said not only did Aboriginal title exist, but it had never been extinguished, so it still existed. 3 judges said Aboriginal titles exist, but it has been extinguished. We'll come back to that in a second. And the 7th judge said, well, British Columbia wasn't the correct party to this appeal, therefore the case is overturned. So the case was actually lost at the Supreme Court. But it's one of those decisions where, despite the fact that the Nisga'a lost the case, the decision recognized the existence of Aboriginal title. The judges who said that Aboriginal title had been extinguished were working with the historical legislation of the colony of British Columbia before it joined Canada, and said that in the actions of the colony of British Columbia, they had extinguished title. The 3 judges who argued the other side said that no, that had never operated. It's incredibly important because, in fact, at that moment in time, Papa Trudeau sits up and realizes that, wait a minute, we've got something serious on our hands. We actually have something called Aboriginal title. We don't know what that is, but we actually have something called Aboriginal title, and we have to deal with it. Okay? So at that point, things start becoming quite critical. They move into dealing with land claims. They begin the process of thinking about dealing with land claims. And it's pushed on by 2 major and very important events. The first event is the development of hydropower in northern Quebec. So this is the announcement by Bourassa in Quebec that they are going to dam the rivers of northern Quebec, and they are going to develop a major hydroelectric development in northern Quebec. The lands in Quebec had never, ever been dealt with by treaty. They'd never been ceded. Nothing had ever been done. And the Cree folks in northern Quebec sort of were listening to the news one morning on the CBC and heard that the government of Quebec was about to flood all of their land, and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. A guy called Philip Awashich said that. And they took the government of Quebec to court. They actually filed for an injunction to stop the work. It's a very important case that is heard over 1974, coming into 1975. It's heard by a guy called Justice Maloof. And Justice Maloof hears the case. I have to tell you another one of my favorite stories that comes out of, and there are wonderful stories in all of this. There's a very good book called Strangers Devour the Land by a guy called Boyce Richardson, which tells all of these stories. But one of my favorite is that they had flown in both Cree elders and Inuit elders into Montreal to testify in court. And they put the Inuit elders up in the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. And if you know Montreal, the Queen Elizabeth is sort of the equivalent of the Fort Garry. It's more modern and nicer, but it's kind of equivalent. And of course, Inuit elders like to eat seal meat. They don't know how to eat this white man food. So they brought in seal meat for the Inuit elders. But did I tell you this story? Well, it must be in my class. So, but think about it. How do you eat a seal, a raw seal, in a hotel room? Okay. The way Inuit usually do it is you put cardboard boxes down on the floor. You put the seal on the cardboard boxes. Right, Brian? Everybody gets a knife and they eat it, right? Well, how do you do that in a hotel room? Well, they did the smart thing. They put it in the bathtub. Had their dinner and breakfast, and then went off to court. Of course, the hotel housekeeping staff and find this butchered corpse in the bathtub, and immediately call the police and shut down the entire Queen Elizabeth Hotel. until they work out that actually it's a dead seal. Anyway, so Maloof hears the evidence from the Cree and the Inuit of northern Quebec, and he actually grants them the injunction. He says, no, title has never been dealt with on this land. The Quebec government does not have the right to proceed in their operations, and therefore grants the Cree and the Inuit the injunction. Work does stop for 5 days. The Quebec government, as you would expect, appealed it to the Quebec Supreme or Superior Court, and this is one of the problems that comes up all the time for First Nations. The greater good of society overrules the Indigenous rights of Cree and Inuit. And so the Supreme Court, or Superior Court of Quebec, overturns the decision and the project goes ahead. But at that point they realize that, wait a minute, we have a problem on our hands. This land has never been ceded. There is no treaty. We've got to do something about it. So while they're building the dams, the Cree and the Inuit are desperately trying to negotiate a modern treaty. And in the end they do. That's the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975, which is the first modern treaty. Okay, very important treaty, there's quite a number of important features about it. I won't go into all of them. One thing we must remember is, and we'll come back to this again and again, the Government of Canada insists that the treaties must cede, surrender, give up all rights and privileges and titles to the land. So there is what we call the extinguishment clause in all of these. They will not allow any other kind of agreement. So the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, which is the first modern one, does have the extinguishment clause in it. Okay? And it says they cede, surrender, give up, whatever the wording is in the treaty, or in the land claim. Where it differs from the historical land claims is that it fairly clearly lays out a regime of other kinds of rights and privileges, not privileges, but other kinds of rights that are granted to the Cree and the Inuit in return for giving up the land. Okay, there are some very interesting features to it, but I'll just tell you one of the most interesting features is the harvester support program, the hunter support program that's built into that agreement. In fact, there's an arrangement in the agreement that if people so choose, they can choose to go back and live on the land, and they can give up the right to take welfare payments or support payments, and in return will be paid to live and hunt on the land. And that has been a hugely successful program. And in fact, the Quebec government every 10 years keeps reevaluating it. And one of the things they keep discovering is that these folks who they're paying to live on the land are actually producing more food by living on the land than they are paying them, and they're actually supporting and subsidizing the communities through the amount of food that they're producing. And in fact, large numbers of Cree, the Inuit use it differently, but large numbers of Cree went back to living on the land and living off the land because of this arrangement. It's a very interesting piece in that particular agreement. There are two problems with the James Bay Agreement. Problem number one is they forgot to put in an implementation clause. So there's nothing in the agreement that actually says anybody has to do anything. And so, as you might guess, the federal government and the Quebec government did absolutely nothing. Okay? The Cree continually took the federal government and the Quebec government back to court year after year after year for failing to fulfill their obligations under the agreement. Every year the court ruled in favor of the Cree, and every year the federal government did absolutely nothing. Okay. It finally came to a climax with over a health issue when typhus broke out in one of the communities and 4 children died. And finally, at that point, the federal government agreed that maybe they should do something. So since then, there have been, and there's a secondary arrangement. a couple secondary agreements that force the federal government and the Quebec government to actually honor the agreement. Okay. The other thing that the agreement does is it establishes a Cree school board, a Cree health board, an Inuit school board, and an Inuit health board, which have all been extremely important in Quebec in terms of providing education and health services. Long time ago when I was young, and I taught in Montreal, I used to teach for the Cree school board in Montreal. It was one of the most fun things I ever got to do, was teaching for them. But it's been very important that both the Cree and the Inuit in northern Quebec have been able to develop their own education and health resources. More recently, there has been agreements with the government of Quebec over governance and regional governance and more control to the Cree and the Inuit for regional governance. But those are quite recent in the past few years. Okay. So, 1975, very important with this agreement. You get some engagement by the churches. This is one of the first things where the churches begin to sit up and take notice that, wait a minute, there is a gross injustice out here, and maybe we should start thinking about it. I could say, unfortunately for the Anglicans, there aren't a whole lot of Anglicans in Quebec, and so the pressure for us to do stuff in Quebec is pretty low. All right, and of course we're also coming into the years of our dear friend René Lévesque and the rise of the Parti Québécois, when all the Anglicans leave Quebec and move to Toronto. And Paul can speak to that. He lived through those years, or just after, right? Yeah.
Except the Indigenous Anglicans.
Except this is one of the things. There are quite a few Indigenous Anglicans. This is one of the parts where you get Indigenous Anglicans. You have to be a bit careful because all the ones in southern Quebec are Roman Catholic, of course. But they're the Cree are kind of split between Anglican and Catholic, and of course the Inuit are Anglicans. Okay. I shouldn't say of course the Inuit are Anglicans, but the Inuit are Anglicans. The Roman Catholic Church, by the way, had a whole bunch of missionaries up in northern Quebec. There wasn't a whole lot for them to do. So they did something actually really important. They founded all the co-ops. Didn't get any converts, but they founded the co-ops in each of the communities. So, so there was not a lot of engagement by the Anglican Church in the political issues in Quebec at that time. But it is a sort of growing awareness that there's some profound injustices. The other thing we need to remember in Manitoba is that at precisely the same time we have the development of the Churchill River diversion project, the Churchill River hydro project in Manitoba, okay, where they're damming the Churchill River, flooding southern Indian Lake, reversing the flow of the rivers, and putting it through the Nelson River, okay. You find much less engagement in Manitoba. Part of the reason is, of course, that was covered by Treaty 5. So the Manitoba government's attitude was, the land is being ceded under Treaty 5, tough luck guys, it's our land, we can do what we want with it. And so you have to watch that. In Manitoba you don't get the kind of resistance, the kind of court pressure that you get in Quebec. All right, there is resistance, and the church is actually quite actively involved in that, and it leads to a series of agreements, again, which have never been fulfilled. Okay. Incidentally, I had one of those moments today, and I hope you have it too. When I was on the way home, and I was listening to Mr. Pallister talking about the fact that we have the carbon tax that's now being imposed by the federal government onto Manitoba, whether we like it or not. By the way, I think that's a good thing, but we can argue that in another case. And Mr. Pallister, of course, is objecting and saying that we shouldn't have to pay it because we have the greenest province, because we rely the most on electricity. Argument one, if we have the greenest province, then we will pay the least carbon tax. The carbon tax is on based on how much you use, right? So, which I don't believe is true, but that's the theory. Two, Has anybody ever bothered to count the environmental damage that our hydroelectric dams have caused? And the cost that that's created? And has anybody ever done anything to mitigate the cost of the environmental damage from our hydroelectric dams, our so-called green energy? I don't know, but I doubt that any of the money's ever going to be used for that, but it might want us as Manitobans to reflect on the fact that we've created enormous environmental destruction in northern Manitoba, and we've done absolutely nothing to try and deal with that. So, and that comes out of what's going on in northern Manitoba. So, folks, it's still an issue. The folks in Nelson House, Norway House, Split Lake, Cross Lake are all continuing to fight it. All right, and it's still there. It's still a fight.
So, on the Quebec North Shore of Robertson Lake Hydro Project, the Quebec government made a token effort to remove the trees, which was impossible.
They did that in Manitoba too.
But you can't remove the trees, and then...
Well, not if you flood it first and then try to remove the trees, which is what they did in Manitoba.
Is that what they did?
Yeah. I was there. I saw it.
Yeah, so...
I have to confess that I worked for 3 years, not on the hydro dams, but on the archaeological projects.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, they're supposed to remove the trees and they're supposed to clear the land.
But you can't.
You can't.
It's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. And it creates huge amounts of methane. So.
Too many trees, and then it was like
Mercury
and methane and all kinds of stuff. It's a disaster. So, the next major one that we need to note and we want to think about briefly, and this is where I think some of you will really start clicking in, is the discovery of oil, of course, in Prudhoe Bay, off of the coast of Alaska, and then the desire to ship that oil south via a pipeline down the Mackenzie Valley. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that? Yes. Well, you're too young. But they don't look that way, Donna. He's too young. This is where you see, and this is the reason I want to spend a moment with this, this is where you begin to see the major initial church engagement of these issues through what then was called Project North, through various configurations. Project North is now Kairos, okay? But through Project North, the Anglican Church, along with the United Church and the Presbyterians, although the Presbyterians go in and out a couple of times, joined together to actually actively work with the local communities and oppose the development of the pipeline. Okay, so this is one of the first major political actions that the Anglican Church engages in through Project North. It's kind of interesting, just kind of back to Paul's point. There aren't a whole lot of Protestant First Nations up the Mackenzie Valley. Most of them are Catholic, except for Witchin. Witchin, at the top end of the Mackenzie Valley, are Anglican. Okay, because of Archdeacon MacDonald, who's a graduate of St. John's College, and who went up there and was a missionary. He was an Métis. He was an Métis graduate of college and went up as a missionary at Muncie Witchin. And so, of course, it worked out perfectly. We all know that. That's the way it is. So the church actively begins to engage. That is, of course, when there's a sufficient protest that the government pays attention, and they appoint Justice Thomas Berger to undertake what became known as Berger Inquiry, Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry. I have to tell you, one of the real privileges of being board with this college is we give honorary degrees. Some really cool people, and I get to hang out with them for a couple of days. And one of them was Justice Berger. I was in total awe for the 2 days I got to spend with Justice Berger, just hanging out with him and talking to him about all these experiences. He is one of my heroes. You know, I'm cynical enough that I don't have too many. But he ran hearings on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. Now, there are a few things here. One is that Project North, along with a number of other organizations, and so the Anglican Church is heavily involved in this, worked very, very hard to organize the local communities to present to Justice Berger. So what they do is they get in and they start doing local community development, local community political organization, at a very local level. We're talking all these little tiny First Nations communities up and down the Mackenzie Valley. And the Anglican Church, along with a number of other organizations, CYC, Canada, Company of Young Canadians, do a lot of work organizing politically at the local level so that the local communities are prepared to present to Justice Berger when he comes. Okay, so that's where we begin to come in. A couple of other things about that. You may, on looking at maps, have come to realize that that land had already been ceded by Treaty 8, part of it, the southern part is Treaty 8, and the northern part is Treaty 11. So you're thinking, okay, so what's the problem if it's already been ceded by Treaty 8, Treaty 11? Well, a certain Roman Catholic priest by the name of Father Fumalo, who is another one of my heroes, although I've never met Father Fumalo. I gather he's still alive. Yeah. Father Fumalo did a little bit of research, wrote a wonderful book called As Long as the River Shall Run, where he points out that if you actually do a little research on Treaty 11, you'll discover that on the treaty, a lot of people have signed with an X, and it says, you know, so-and-so is Mark. Yeah, the same day that they signed the treaty, they were able to sign with their full name and signature their credit and debit sheets at the Hudson's Bay Company. So he says, okay, well, wait a minute, who actually put the X on the treaty if these guys are perfectly capable of signing their own names on the Hudson's Bay Company? The second thing, of course, he did by doing a little bit of research is found out that about a third of the people who signed the treaty actually weren't there. They were out in the bush hunting. Okay? And so he was actually able to demonstrate this, and when they took it to the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories, the Supreme Court basically said Treaty 11 is invalid. However, they did say it remains in effect, it remains in force until the government negotiates another treaty. Okay? So Treaty 11 was overturned, which is really, really quite interesting, and we can thank Father Fumalo for that. All of this is happening at the same time that Justice Berger is doing his inquiry. The other thing that's, of course, very important about Justice Berger is that he actually went and listened to each of the communities, and that's probably the first time that's ever happened in the history of Canadian inquiries. And I don't know, those of you who are old enough to remember sitting watching the television newscasts, you know, every night there's a shot of Justice Berger sitting there in some rickety old chair they dragged out of the mission house at a card table with people sitting all around on the ground around him. And he was willing to sit there and listen as long as the people talked. So if they took 5 days to tell him what they had to say, he sat there for 5 days and listened. Okay? That, again, has never happened in the history of inquiries. And so for the first time, we really began to hear the stories of these people who were still living on the land and intimately engaged with the land. Okay? I think it was a very important moment in Canadian history. I think for a lot of us, and I'm still fairly young at the time. I'm 17, 18 at the time. The impact of sitting and watching that happening and hearing those stories on a day-to-day basis suddenly begins to sort of get into my consciousness of, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. As you know, Justice Berger recommended at the end of that inquiry that a 10-year moratorium be put on any development and the government settle any outstanding land claims. By the time Justice Berger made that recommendation, unfortunately, the price of oil had crashed through the bottom of the floor due to OPEC, and so it was no longer economically feasible to undertake the project anyways. So circumstances have worked out that the project didn't happen, at least didn't happen at that time. Okay, maybe happening now. So those are very important movements. They become critical to Canadians in terms of realizing there are Indigenous issues out there. They are critical to the church because for the church, that's the first time we as a church engaged politically and socially in these issues and began to become involved. So you see the rising dynamic here as the church becomes more deeply engaged with these. I'm not going to go through all of the claims. I gave you a sheet there that, in bright colors, none of which I can see, outlines all the land claims. Those are the claims that have been settled under this arrangement. Now, there are two kinds of claims. There are comprehensive claims, and these are all comprehensive claims. There are comprehensive claims which are claims in areas where there has never been any previous settlement, where there's never any previous treaty. Okay? So there's a whole series now of modern comprehensive claims, and this one maps out where they are. Okay? We'll come back to those in a second. There's also a series called specific claims. And specific claims are areas where there are treaties, where there have been historical arrangements, such as in Manitoba, and where First Nations groups can demonstrate that their land has been illegally appropriated from them, okay? Or that they never received the land in the first place, or it's been illegally appropriated, okay? There are about 900 specific claims, so I'm not going to go through them. There are lots. Basically every single reserve in Canada can demonstrate that they were either not given their land or land has been taken away from them. Not all they have to do, they have to demonstrate it. They can demonstrate it to the government, and then out of that, they can negotiate compensation. Just to tell you, one of the technical problems with specific claims is that if land has been removed from them, which is often what the issue is, and that is recognized, then how do you give land back to them in return? Because that land has already been sold off and is being farmed by somebody else, right? That's the first problem. The second problem is, of course, because this is an entirely federal government issue, you have to give them federal crown land. Now, does anybody know where there's federal crown land in Manitoba? Rod?
Keniston Barracks.
Yeah, army bases in general. So Shiloh is also federal crown land. Yeah, the Keniston is a good example. Where else is there federal crown land?
Parks.
Parks.
National parks.
Prisons.
Certain prisons, of course, federal prisons.
Along the water bridge, isn't it?
Well, yes, but that's a very narrow strip. Also things like where the post office is located, that's federal crown land, in case you haven't thought of it. Also where the RCMP are located, that's federal crown land.
17 wing.
Well, 17 wing, it's all military bases, are all crown land, federal crown land. So when the federal government makes an agreement, say with Russo River, and says, okay, we owe you, 800 acres. Where do you find 800 acres of federal crown land in Manitoba? Or at least 800 acres of free or open federal crown land in Manitoba. Pretty tricky. The government in some cases has bought land from the provincial governments and given it to the First Nation. In other cases you get into stuff like the Keniston, like the Churchill Barracks. Okay. So that's one of the things around specific claims is, well, it's all very well to agree that we owe them 800 acres, but where's the 800 acres coming from? Okay, so usually they go for cash settlements, by the way, instead. But so specific claims are another whole level. And in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the federal government established what they call the treaty claims process. So there is actually an internal process on the prairies because there are so many claims for them to deal with it here. Right. So back to the comprehensive claims that are on the map. The second major claim you'll see is up the top corner there. It's the, I don't know what color that is, the Inequality Final Agreement. 1984? Is that blue? Okay. That one. The blue one. Inuvialuit are one of the subgroups of Inuit. They're the Western Arctic Inuit. They speak a significantly different dialect from other Inuit groups. They were in a situation where originally they were negotiating their land claim with the Eastern Arctic Inuit of Nunavut. But they had the rather technical problem that they had people drilling oil wells in their territory and building docks and bases for the oil drilling in their territory. So they couldn't wait for the Eastern Arctic to get its act together. So they broke off in 1980 and made their own settlement, which they made in 1984. Okay. I will tell you that the Inuvialuit final agreement is probably of all the agreements the best agreement. Okay, it's the one that's most favorable to the people involved. All right. They, believe it or not, they got the most land, and believe it or not, they got some of the best arrangements over management control over local resources. One of the things that they introduced into the process, which is now very important, is they introduced what are called co-management boards. These are largely boards dealing with wildlife and management of wildlife. There are other boards like the water board, the land board, I can't remember what they all are, but there are 5 boards. The key one is the wildlife board. And what they were able to do is transfer control over wildlife to those boards. And the boards are, well, because of the way they're structured, they're more than 50% Inuvialuit representation on it. And so they have a very strong say in their own management of wildlife in their area. Okay? And the Inuvialuit have got the most experience at this, and they're way ahead of everybody else on this right now. So it's quite an interesting settlement. The idea of the co-management board appears in all the following agreements, but it's rather critical there.
Is the way that it's drawn into the Arctic based on the offshore drilling? Like that it's not just following shoreline?
Well, no, there's a couple of other things in there.
Okay.
The part of it has to do with which communities decided to leave the Nunavut arrangement and go with this. A lot of those, by the way, are longitudinal lines. Okay, they're just using them. So what they've done is they've extended the line between Yukon and Alaska and just extended it straight out. Okay, the bottom line has more to do with the communities and the land around the communities. Okay, so that's what that is, and that's why it goes over. I recognize that your geography may not be strong enough to know that includes a chunk of Victoria Island and all of Banks Island. But that has to do with which communities chose to join. Okay. There are 6 communities in the Inuvialuit final agreement. There's actually also some interesting pieces in there because it's also an agreement where it deals with land that's in both Northwest Territories and in Yukon, and it deals with overlapping relationships with which not many of the other agreements deal with. Okay, it's got a whole bunch of really interesting features in it, but that's why it's the shape it is. Okay.
Can I ask why it's called there's either final agreements as opposed to land claim?
Well, they're all final agreements.
Yeah.
It's just how they call them.
Sure.
I didn't get into because it doesn't, because the churches didn't have a whole lot to do with it, but of course the other thing you've got going on a little bit after this, or at the same time actually, it's the constitutional negotiations, where Trudeau decides to repatriate the Constitution. And then you get into a massive and complicated debate over how to do that, right? Essentially, except for the section that recognizes existing Aboriginal rights in the Constitution and recognizes Aboriginal peoples, There's not a whole lot about Aboriginal peoples in the 1982 Constitution. But one of the agreements was that they would then have a series of negotiations. And some of you may remember the negotiations that go through the 1980s between the federal government and the First Nations. And that's over what kind of governance you're going to have. Now, those negotiations fail, ultimately fail. But the one thing that does come out of those negotiations is an agreement that all treaties and all land claims agreements are constitutional. Okay, so they are part of the Canadian Constitution. And so what that does is it makes them incredibly difficult to change. And that's when we get into the idea of final. You really can't do a whole lot to change these things. To be able to change them, you have to, first of all, have the agreement of all the Inuvialuit, but on the Canadian side, you have to have the agreement of all the provinces and the Senate and Parliament in order to be able to change the Canadian side of it. So it's so complicated to change it, it's not possible to do so right now. Okay, so that's when they start using the final language, because you can't do much about it. You're stuck. Which is also a problem, by the way, as well as an advantage.
Just a quick question: if I look at the agreement with Nunavut land claims,
We're going to get to that, yeah.
1993. I suspect the Northwest Passage and Churchill will come back into our front and center with shipping. Does this mean that they will have a voice in world shipping going through their waters?
A highly, highly disputed point. You're taking the American position. The American position is that the shipping lanes are international waters, and therefore they come under international agreements. The Canadian position is no, they're not international waters, they're Canadian waters, and therefore they come under Canadian jurisdiction. Nobody, except for the Manhattan and a few other incidents, nobody has really concluded on that one. And the current issue around that, Simon, is because of the climate change. Those waters are becoming more open and accessible, and so it's becoming more and more of an issue. All right, but it's being settled through another process through the United Nations.
Do the Nunavut have a voice?
Maybe. Sometimes, if the government remembers, occasionally. Is it not? Yeah, it's, no.
Only if the interests overlap.
Well, from the Inuit point of view, the interests always overlap, but it's difficult. This is a slightly different issue, but for example, they wanted to do seismic testing in Baffin Bay, which is off of Baffin Island, up here, off this part of Baffin Island,
Right.
which means that what you do is you chuck bombs over the side of a boat, and then you feel the vibrations, you record the vibrations in the rock. The Inuit, as you might guess, objected that blowing up bombs in the water might affect the whales and the seals and the walruses and the general marine wildlife. And basically, the federal government said they didn't have to pay any attention to it because under the environmental protection, they had done due diligence. The Inuit took them to court. The very brave folks of Clyde River, and I happen to know a lot of people who were involved in this fight, took them to the Supreme Court on it and won. That in fact they do have a say in it. But they have to take them to the Supreme Court to get that. And that ruling was last summer. Okay, this is very recent. So the answer is always maybe. When you get into things like waters and navigable waterways, they're technically under federal control, and none of the land claims agreements give the First Nations, not even, and this is a very sensitive thing about Treaty 5 in Manitoba, none of the land claims agreements give First Nations control over the waterways. Okay? So their ability to negotiate that, they're hamstrung from the beginning. Although they have been able to successfully do so.
Can I ask a tangential question about all these court cases? All the court cases that happen? Is there a general mode in which they approach covering the costs of doing all these court cases?
Yes.
Okay.
The federal government pays the bills until the settlement, and then they deduct the costs off of whatever the bill to sell the federal government is. So if there's a court case and the court settles that the federal government has to pay $500 million in damages, which is usually
Just
what
take it off the tab.
then they deduct the legal costs off of that. Okay. So when you see that, for example, the Nunavut land claim, the Inuit received $1.5 billion in the settlement off of that, but then all the court costs got deducted off of that.
Right.
1.4 million.
Well, not quite 1.4 billion, but it was a big chunk of money. So
Okay.
the government fronts the money and then charges it back.
Huh. Okay.
Uh-huh. And so far, you see, the First Nations haven't lost.
So what happens if they lose?
Yeah, well, that's another matter if they lose, but so far they haven't, so.
Speaking of court, you mentioned earlier the 5-day injunction at James Bay. I mean, that must be a record for a case turnaround.
Oh, when the government wants to turn around a case, they can do it real fast.
Yeah.
And so can the courts.
One might expect it to be 5 months at least, or 5 years, or the other way around.
It's amazing how quickly the courts can act when they need to.
Eastern James Bay, how come that chunk is part of Nunavut and not part of Nunavik?
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Eastern Hudson's Bay.
Yes. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Do you really want an answer to that question? Okay. Remember that I said that anything offshore belongs to the federal government, that the provincial territory only goes up to the high tide line. So all of those islands, and there are a whole string of them, you can't see them on the map. All of those islands were federal crown land, not Quebec, even though they were occupied by the Inuit and the Cree of Quebec. Okay, so they all come under the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement.
Does that mean they're part of Nunavut?
Technically, yes. In fact, there's a whole series of agreements between Nunavut and the folks in northern Quebec that basically says, yeah, it's really nice. Except for the Belcher Islands, which are in the middle of this, you can't really see them. The Belcher Islands are part of Nunavut. That's where San Kilback is. I don't know whether that means anything very much, but they're clearly part of Nunavut. But all the rest of it is as well.
Good thing there's no colonialism involved in this.
No. You see, as you ask these questions, you begin to see the colonial apparatus more and more. By the way, there are multiple layers in here. Quebec is not happy with that arrangement either. Okay? So not only are the Inuit and Cree annoyed at that arrangement, but Quebec's annoyed.
That's the province that said if we secede from Canada, the Cree of northern Quebec can't secede from Quebec.
Yeah. And the Cree of northern Quebec said try it. And voted against 92% against it. I was there when that happened. Eric.
I thought all of Hudson Bay was part of Nunavut. I
Um,
understand it's in Churchill, like 50 feet off the shoreline, you're in Nunavut.
You probably are, but the map's not really showing it. Yeah, you're getting into the finer details that aren't going to show on how it is.
But that's important in terms of.
Well, if you're shipping out of Churchill,
Shipping.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the same reason. Once you get offshore, it's federal crown land, and therefore it can dealt with under the Nunavut claim. Okay. I just wanted. Time for a break. It's 10 to 8. It's time for a break, and then we'll come back. We'll talk briefly about Nunavut, and then we'll start talking about who owns the land.